My name is Tobias. I'm going to talk to you about messaging queues. Here's my Twitter handle, so if you want to harass me for the next 45 minutes, I can't defend myself. Let's start simple. This is a stack. It's a simple data structure. It has a top and a bottom. And you put things on top of it, and you get things from the top as well. So it's a last in, first out. If you flip it, you have a queue, which has a back and a front. So you put things on the back of the queue and takes things out of the front of the queue. Queues and stacks are simple data structures. They are super quick, they order one, and they're easy to implement as well. I'm not going to talk about the data structure anymore. I think you all know what I just showed you. And I'm going to talk about how I made applications in the past and how I made applications now. It's not going to be a journey in time. It's more going to be a journey in my experience. And the point is to make small applications that you rarely update and that are super scalable. So that's the agenda. That's my plan for today. Does it sound good? How many of you are using queues now? I mean, it's about 40%, 30%. Great. Great. You used to tell me if I'm talking too slow or if I'm talking too fast or if you want to have more time on some slides. But some slides have a lot of codes in them, some slides don't. So you just give me some feedback. If you don't, I'm going to ask for it. Like I said, my name is Tobias. I work at a company called Happier. I do plenty of Symfony stuff. I run the PHP meetups in Stockholm. And I also work plenty with open source. I started my open source career in 2015. PHP-6 just came out, and me and my friends hey, let's do an implementation of this. So we implemented PHP-6, which is caching. So we did PHP cache, we did a cache bundle, and at the same time I started to be interested in HTTP. So I started working with an abstraction over HTTP client called HTTP plug. And when you do HTTP clients, you also do API clients, and then use mail clients. And then nowadays I maintain both Bus and Guzzle. I do my own PSR implementation. I'm writing a PSR for HTTP clients, PSR 18. I'm doing plenty. My favorite library is this one. It's called NSA. It totally violates class privacy. So accessing private properties or private methods is super simple with NSA. Excellent for testing, but worthless for everything else. Don't use it in production. Anyhow, that's short about me. Let's bring you back to 2013. I was working at Happier. I've been doing Symfony for 4 years already. And I kind of like the framework. I liked everything related to the Symfony framework. And the Symfony framework had this concept called bundles. I loved bundles. In my application, I had 30, 40, or 50 bundles. I have bundles for everything. If I needed comments, I have the comment bundle. And if I needed a user bundle, a company bundle, I have bundles for everything. And the bundles, they were quite fat. They had configuration, they have templates, JavaScript, they have controllers, they had services, they have command, they had everything in them, even translation files. And so they were quite fat. And there were some magic. This is back in Symfony 2 something. There were some magic. Commands wouldn't be registered as command, like CLI commands. You have to put them in a special directory called commands, and the command has to be called whatever command.php. If you didn't name them that way, they wouldn't be recognized. They wouldn't get any error messages at all. So there was a bit of magic doing a bundle. And obviously, my controllers look like this. This is an import controller. The code is not important. So it was quite fat. And if I needed the same import functionality in my CLI, I just copied this code and put it in the CLI command. I actually was pretty happy about myself here. I mean, sure, this code looks like a mess and I understand it now, but I thought I was a Symfony expert. I mean, sure, I wasn't on top of Mount Stupid, but I thought I was a Symfony expert. I have no issues maintaining this. I know exactly what every bundle did. I know exactly where the code was. I know all this Symfony hidden magic. So, and new developers obviously couldn't maintain this, but I felt like you can't maintain this because you're not Symfony expert. So I was pretty happy about myself developing this application. But I realized I should improve somehow. And at the same time, Twitter was all about this. They said, you should test your controllers. And I'm like, why should I test my controllers? I don't test any other code. So why is the controller special? Anyhow, so I figured if you should test your controllers, you should register your controls as services. So services has to be good. So I started using services all over the place. So I started to slim down my controllers and have large services. And you know, in a controller, it's kind of a nice place to be because you have this get, which gives you a service, and you have this get user and this get parameter, and there's easy to develop in a controller compared to a service. So I thought, let's bring this experience of developing the controller into services. So whenever you're in a service and you need the current user, let's use the get current user provider service. I thought this was a great idea because it made my life better. Obviously, it wasn't merged. People were discussing that if I needed a user in a service, I should pass it as a parameter, which is the proper solution. Same thing with the request. I mean, back in Symfony 2.3, 2.2, whatever, the request was a service. And you have all of these issues with the container, with accessing the request. I didn't mind. I was a Symfony expert, so I didn't mind doing that. But it was way complicated. So what I did, I started doubting myself that I really was a Symfony expert since this was started being too complex. And also it was too much magic all over the place. So at the time, this guy was touring Europe. Do you know this guy? Okay, this guy is Matthias Noback. For me, he's not like a mentor, but he has some really great ideas that he tells the world. I mean, he have told me, he told the audience that one year he said, Symfony is the best framework. Everyone should use Symfony. The next year, when I met him at the conference, he said, frameworks are bad. Never use a framework again. So I was quite confused at the time. And then the third year he came back and said, this is when you should use frameworks. I mean, you should not use the frameworks all the time, but sometimes you really should use the framework. So he was touring Europe with this hexagonal design, which basically means that you keep your kernel, like your application, your core, you keep it away from the infrastructure. So you let the framework handle all the infrastructure stuff, and then you write your application in pure PHP, and the framework in your application communicates over messages. So I created messages for everything. So here's a message for create a company. And I have a handler that handles this message later. So what we do is we have a controller that takes something from HTTP, convert that to a message. It creates a command, put the command on the command bus, and then it eventually reached my command handler. Fair? Good. So the bus here works as a boundary between the real world and my application. So everything outside the bus is the real world. Everything in here is my application, my core, my kernel. And this would be the same thing if I wrote a CLI command. The CLI command would, my Symfony command would take something from the CLI input, convert it to a command, put it on the bus, and it goes to the handler. So you get it, I don't have to repeat myself. So our core is not connected to the outside world anymore. Our core is not even connected to Symfony. Our core is just plain PHP that we have written. So in 2016, I took on an intern in my company. He was a junior developer. He has worked a lot with Laravel. So he was a bit anxious starting working with me. I mean, because I was this self-claimed Symfony expert, and all our apps was running on Symfony. But after a month or two, when he was working with this architecture, he realized there's not much Symfony here. Symfony is just some configuration that already been set up. What I'm writing is just PHP and our company-created classes. So if you haven't really heard about this or hexagonal design, I just give a super quick overview of the best bits. You should read I will share this on Twitter later. I mean, just Google it. Matthias Noback and Ross Tuck has done some major blog posts and lectures and stuff. So it's a good thing to know of. You don't really have to adopt it, but you should know of it. So we should ask ourselves, what did we really win here? Why couldn't the controller just call the command handler directly? Why do we have to go through this all hassle using a bus? The simple answer is middlewares. We can have middlewares. And we can have middlewares for like logging, so we can log all the changes in our application. We can have middlewares for validation, so make sure the messages are correct. We can have middlewares for doctrine transactions to make sure that everything in our handler is going to one doctrine transaction. We could also use a middleware for queues. So let's talk about queues. I'm not going to talk about queues as the data. I'm not going to talk about queues as the data object. I'm going to talk about queues as services. And there's a fly chasing me. Queues as a service then. This is a simple queue. This is a simple way of structuring your queue. It's a working queue, so you have one producer, and then you have one or more consumers. And if one consumer goes down, the other consumer is still up and consumes all the messages. And this is a nice work queue. And what you should do when you configure a queue, you should make it durable, which means that if the queue goes down, the queue itself goes down, you should your messages shouldn't disappear. The queue should store the message on disk, not only in memory. And you should also make sure that you should configure it with acknowledgement, which means that if a consumer takes a message from the queue and then the consumer dies, that message shouldn't be disappeared. So that message should automatically be recreated on the queue. So each consumer should take a message from the queue, do some work with it, and then acknowledge that this message is done now. We have handled it. So durable and acknowledgement. And then you can set up a simple work queue like this. Another way of setting up your queue is a publish-subscribe, which basically is you have a producer that communicates to an exchange. This is the blue circle. And the exchange here, you can set it to fan out. So it basically fans out to different queues. So if consumer B now goes down, the messages on that queue will still be there. So the 2 days from now, when the consumer B comes back up, they will still see all the messages. So depending on your situation, this might be more preferable. Or you can be smarter. You can use routing. So basically, on a message, you say, "Hey, this is a foo message." So the exchange know, "Yeah, I'll put it on this queue to consumer A." And you can have multiple routing keys for the same queue. You can even do something like this, which is the same thing as a fan out. Or if you want to be even more sophisticated, this is overkill for my use cases, is to use topics, which basically you have wildcards on your routing keys. Say they have these different topics. So consumer A is only interested in errors, no matter where they occur. And consumer B is interested in everything that has with app to do, and also firewall. So this is great for logging, for instance. Say consumer A logs all the errors, no matter where they occur. Is this understandable? Is this like, I get it? Fair. So, let's leave 2013 and leave all the theory behind, and let's see how you should work with this today. And obviously, I have to say, if you want to use with queues and messages, this is the best packages for you. There are some others as well. I mean, this is basically simple bus, but with a seamless Symfony integration. The concepts are pretty much the same, but now I'm using Symfony Messenger as with the code examples. Symfony Messenger is released with Symfony 4.1. It is marked as experimental, which basically means try it as much as you can. If you find any bugs, you do report them. The API could maybe change until December, but probably not. So please try it out if you haven't before. So remember this annotation. I have a controller that creates a message and put it on the bus, and it goes to the message handler. I'm gonna write it like this now. So I have a message, goes to the bus, and goes to the message handler. And let's look at the message. It's just a simple PHP class. It doesn't extend anything. It doesn't implement anything. Here's a message for send notifications. And I just have two properties and some getters. And in my controller, I want to create this. So I just get something from the request. I get something from HTTP, and I create a new send notification message. And I ask the bus to dispatch it. I was here earlier today and listened to the Symfony 4 talk this morning, and I noticed that not all of you are using Symfony 4 in production right now, which makes me a little bit disappointed. However, this is Symfony 4 notations. I'm not sure if this is familiar to you or not, but using injections like this is super, super convenient. So I just say, hey, I want a message bus. I'm gonna assume that you understand this. Anyhow, if I run this controller, I obviously get an error. Symfony is nice enough to tell me, hey, you have no handler for this message. So let's create a handler. A handler is just a normal PHP class, doesn't extend anything, doesn't implement anything. It just has an invoke method. So I invoke the handler for this message. And here I'm just looping over all the users and echo out the message. So, and I have to register this handler as a service. I could do it one by one, like with this notation. Or I could say everything that's in source message command handler should be a message handler. And obviously you use one of these and you forgot to ever wrote it. So if I run my command now, or if I run my controller now, I'll get something like this. Make sense? Excellent. But what if when I'm sending a notification, what if it takes longer time? What if you update something on Twitter and Twitter do it synchronously, pings all your friends? That doesn't really make sense, right? So we have to do this asynchronously. So what we introduce is the concept of transports. And what we do is we take the message, we dispatch it on the bus sends it to transport. At some point later, a worker receives the message and dispatches it on the bus again and gives it to the handler. And a transport has a few concepts. I'm going to stand over here. A transport has a few concepts. It has a sender and a receiver. Also has, it should be configurable by a DSN string, like the long URL looking thing. And it should have some way to encode and decode. And by default, we're using Symfony serializer to encode and decode. And this is pretty much how you configure your transport. You say framework messenger transport, name it the default transport, and then you use your DSN. Here's an environment variable. And then you say, whenever the bus gets a send notification message, you should use a default transport. So this is the only thing you need to do to make sure that you're using a transport. And when you run the controller again with this configuration, you just get OK. And I can tell you, this loads super quickly. Because we didn't really do anything. We didn't send any notifications, right? We just put it on the queue. So what we need to do is, we need to actually execute, we need to read from the queue. So using this command, starts reading from the queue, and we can see this output. And this command runs with while true, so it runs forever. So obviously, you don't have any memory leaks in your application, but other people may do. That's why you have parameters like only run for 100 messages or 300 seconds. So what really happened here, I see that you're a little bit confused. So what really happened here, I have a RabbitMQ implementation. RabbitMQ is like the most common queue in our part of the world, PHP developers. So what I did is, Sorry, I thought it would be a cool animation there. If you don't want to use RabbitMQ, if you want to use something else, there are other transports for you. So the component ships with a default AMQP transport. If you want to use something cool like Amazon SQS or Google PubSub or Kafka or Redis or whatever, you can implement your own transport or use NQ. PHP NQ is like this amazing organization that has bridges to all different queues. One common interface, and you can publish to all different queues. So I even saw one person a few months ago, he wrote a transport that puts messages on the file system. So he used the file system as a queue. It's not performant, but he wanted to do this for some reason. So with RabbitMQ, you could have one application that produces your messages and another application just consuming it. And this application doesn't really have to be the same application. It could be the same application, but it could also be a Java application or an application in Go. You don't really care. I mean, nobody cares, not the producer or the consumer. So what happens here? You put the message on a bus. The bus sends it to transport. The transport put it on the RabbitMQ, and depending on how you configure your application and how you configure your queue, as I showed earlier, it may go to the application. The second application goes to that transport worker and to the message handler. This is a great use case for, say that you have an application instance running that serves front-end request. And then you have another worker just processing tasks, sending emails, creating invoices or whatever. And you could have a second message that you dispatch on the first application, goes to the bus, goes to transport, goes to the RabbitMQ, sits there for I don't know how long, and then it could go back to the first application and then be handled there. This is just depending on your configuration. And here's an example configuration. I say that I want to have two queues, one default and one NQ, and then I have a default DNS, and then I have a reference to the ACME configuration in the NQ bundle. And I say to the messenger component, I say, hey, whenever you see a send notification, dispatch it to both queues. Or one, or, I mean, you get it. So your application, as far as it knows, it just reads and writes to queues, and it doesn't really care which queues and what queues. So having something like this makes total sense. Everything okay? Does it seem too complicated, or? It shouldn't be complicated, but it should be powerful. Right? Does it seem kind of powerful, at least? I can assume that you all said yes internally. I'm a big fan of CQRS. CQRS is command and query responsibility segregation or separation or something like that. It basically means that you make a difference between asking for to do something. I'm telling you to create a new user, and then I can also say give me all users. That's a command and a query. And I want to have that supported in the message bundles. I need multiple queues. So I have a command like create user, and the command should have exactly one handler and doesn't return anything. I should always assume if I tell you to create a new user, you will create a new user. If you can't, you throw an exception, but I don't want to hear anything else from you. I have queries, which this should only fetch data, and it should only have one query handler, and I'm expecting a response. I also like to make a difference between actions and reactions. So I'm telling you, create a user, and when the user is created, I want to have an event thrown that says, hey, a user is created. So I have an action and reaction, and I call my reaction events. So I need 3 buses, and obviously I can have 0 or more events. Event listener. So this is something I like. This is something I won't force it on any of you. And I configured this doing something like this. I just said, here's my buses, and I named them command, query, and event bus. And if I name drop some rules, if I want to enforce those rules, I use middlewares. I could have a middleware saying that the command bus should have exactly one handler. Or I can have a middleware that says, oh, obviously validation. And also, since the command is the only thing that makes a change in my application, right? Reactions doesn't make a change, and queries just fetches data. Commands is the only thing that makes a change. So I want to log that change in my event store middleware. Oh, no. I want to use my event store middleware to log that change. So that middleware just dispatch a message, another queue to make sure the event store is updated. And also query bus similar, I just enforce the rules with the middlewares. And if you're coming to Symfony auto-wiring, you probably know this already. I discovered this a few months ago, and I was super excited. And I was on stage like, hey, you know we can do like this. And everybody like, yeah, we know. So I was the only one in the room who didn't know this. I'm going to do the same mistake now. I'm going to tell you that if you have a service that needs a bus, you type in for message bus interface. And if you name the variable command bus, with this configuration, you actually get a command bus. So you bind variable names to actual services. This makes auto-wiring simpler. Did you know this? Yeah, that's okay. This is an example of a query handler. I use gets users for notifications. It's a query handler, and it's exactly the same handler as any other handlers. I mean, it doesn't implement anything, doesn't extend anything. The only small differences is this line. It actually returns something, and this is something I enforce with middlewares, and this is something I would like to relate to. It's obviously easy to dispatch new events, like dispatch new messages from a message handler. Here I am a send notification handler. Yeah, send notification command handler, and I want to dispatch some events saying, hey, a notification was sent. So it's just used an event bus. This is super allowed. I hope you I'm not sure if I explained it properly, but I hope you understand that all the buses and all the handlers and all the events are exactly the same. It's just a way of how I relate to them, and just a way of which middleware I'm using to enforce these rules. I hope that was clear. It's even more clear now. Pardon? Who uses? I don't hear what it is. Middleware. Everybody's using middlewares. Yeah, I should ask you. Yeah, who using middlewares at the moment? That's just 4 or 5 of you. Okay. Do you feel like you know middlewares after I showed you a little bit? Okay. Do you feel like you understand the purpose of middlewares? I can't tell you. If you're using the messenger component, you're actually using some default middlewares. The validation middleware is already there for you, and it will validate your messages if you have annotated them properly. So you are using middlewares. And one thing, there was Samuel Rose. He was the guy who created the first pull request with the messenger component, and he wanted to introduce as few concepts as possible, and he wanted it to work out of the box as easy as, as much as he can working out of the box. So it's super simple to configure and set up and to actually get running, because using queues and buses, there are so many terms and concepts that could be like overwhelming if you just want to try it out. If you just want to try it out like I did now, it could be too many concepts. So everything like works out of the box, and you can have validated messages, and you could, like with 1 or 2 lines configuration, you can actually use a RabbitMQ. I'm going to talk about something that's more relevant, or something that doesn't really get mentioned much when doing Hello World. It's about failures. Because your code will eventually fail somehow. Say that you have a message that goes on the bus dispatches to transport, and then goes to RabbitMQ, and at some point it goes back to transport, the worker receives it and dispatches again, and it goes to message handler. But in the message handler, something wrong happens, right? An exception is thrown, or a type error, or something. It's not clear what to do now, because this could be async. This could be handled like a day afterwards the message was put on the queue, right? So there's no like an exception was thrown and you can get back to the controller. That's not really a thing. So the default way of handling the default way of handling errors is to allow the transport to decide what to do. And the default transport just requeues the message. So basically, at some point very soon, we're going to try again. And if you're using the PHP enqueue bundle, you could actually configure it to say retry after 5 seconds. If the second time you fail, retry after 10 seconds, or something like that. You could also use another strategy. I'm using a strategy whenever an error occurs, I don't requeue it on the same queue. I have an error queue. So all my exceptions go to an error queue, and then like once an hour, once every second hour, I put everything on error queue back to the queue. And believe it or not, but somehow all my problems usually fix themselves within 1 or 2 hours. Or at least I'll see the errors in the log and I can make a change in my code. And if it fails again, I just go back to the error queue again. So I will guarantee that eventually they will be handled. Another default middleware that you are using but you don't know about is the doctrine transaction middleware. That basically says it puts everything the handler does in the same doctrine transaction. So if the first line of the message handler is the write to the database, and the second line throws an exception, the middleware will automatically roll back that write you did. So you don't leave the application in unknown state. Usually when I tell this doctrine transaction, people are a little bit more enthusiastic, like, oh, that's cool, let's use it. But sure. Another thing that I started using this a while back, and then I realized there's something wrong with creating entities. It's not as simple as you think. Say if I have an API endpoint that creates new users. I take a username from the request or a query parameter like this, and then I want to say I want to give a response saying, hey, user is created, look over here. But I don't have any user ID, right? And the command handler doesn't really return anything. So how do I get the user ID? It was more of a rhetorical question, so I wasn't expecting any responses. I could assume that you said you actually send the user ID in the command. So you're saying, hey, I want to create a user with this username and this user ID, and obviously use the UID, not a numerical ID. So in your controller, you create a new UID and say, hey, message bus, please create me this user with this ID and this username. And you know, after this line is executed, you know that a user is created. If the user wasn't created, you would get an exception, obviously. So it's easy to just say, hey, if you want to see your user, go to this URL. So this is how you create new entities. And there's an error. And I'm not sure if you saw it, but on my message, I had some annotations. And this is a cool thing. This is a cool thing. If I just slap on some validator annotations here, the message handler can always be sure that the UID is always a valid UID and it's not blank. And this is validated automatically in the validation middleware. And I can always be sure that the username is at least of a length 3. So I don't need to do these extra checks in my handler. I just slap on the validation here, which is a pretty neat solution. I think I've given you an overview of architecture now and how to use queues and how to use buses. I do know that some of you are like, hey, give me some real use cases. And I've given you only building blocks to create cool use cases yourself. But I want to show off a few. This is a Swedish website selling food online. And they have an architecture of caching everything, which basically means that if an HTTP request come in and have a very, very thin application, just like one file application, and it's just, if it was a GET request, they just fetch something from the cache and serve it. If it was a POST request, like if there were an administrator adding a new item in the store, a POST request just went to the RabbitMQ. At some point later, someone read from RabbitMQ and actually handled this and added new entities or did whatever, and then they updated the cache. So, which means that the users, like the visitors, the 90% of all requests, they always serve the response from cache. So this was the general architecture using a queue. Also, you hear like, what I really don't like with, I've heard many presentations saying, hey, how can we serve 1 million requests per second with a framework or no framework or whatever? And the number one solution is just use the varnish, just cache everything. The second solution is doing something like this. An HTTP request comes in, and you have a thin application that just says 200 OK, and then stores the message on the queue. And then you have plenty of workers working with this at a later time. This application can easily handle 1 million requests a second. Easily. And if you want to be even more hipster or even more cool, you could use an AWS Lambda expression, which is basically just a function in the cloud, which scales up and down automatically. It basically creates itself on request. And this is a perfectly fine application for handling massive workloads. So this is just a few examples of how using queues. I've given you plenty of tips of building blocks, how to configure your queue, and also how to work with them on an application level. And at this point, I want to ask if you have any questions. Got one question in the back. While the mic comes to you, I will have a fake question. You may be asking me, what if you have validation groups? Like, what if you have a validation group and want to specify on the message which validation groups to use? Then it's using envelopes to pass metadata. So what really happened is that you have an envelope, and the message is put in the envelope and then dispatched on the bus. And then it goes to the transport can put it on the queue. At some point later, it goes back to the queue and the worker. And when it comes to bus again, we unpack it. And then we send the message to the bus, to the handler. Oh, sorry. I'm going to show you again because I messed up my slides. And if you want to see this envelope, you add a envelope-aware interface or something it's called. You add that interface on your handler or on your middleware, and you can actually see the metadata passed with the message. Now that gentleman in the back with the shirt would like to do a question.
Thank you for a nice speech. Maybe I have something not understand. I want to clarify some moment. For example, you said about common queries and event buses. And common buses for creating an entities, for example, using common bus. It don't have any response. We don't want response from it. I think we just put in the queue and create the user. We create a GTO with information about user, dispatch with the bus, and it's created. Yes?
Yes.
And we should return the user with this ID in the response. That we created ID before this. We check if its ID could be created. We created then and return. But in fact, it's not created yet. It's putting in the queue. Yes?
Not necessarily. No. If you events like create a new user, they shouldn't be put on a queue. They should be handled directly. They shouldn't be using a transport at all. So you define yourself which messages should go on a queue or not. Like send emails to all the users, that's something that could be handled later. That's the thing you put on a queue.
Yes, it will be, we dispatch it and go, not without queue, it will be synchronic, yes?
Exactly.
So, and if it's not happens, it will be exception, yes?
Exactly.
So, and in this case, we don't respond with this ID that we created, yes?
Yes. You're talking about this slide. I'm going to quickly go back to it.
Yes, about this.
About this slide. What I should do if I'm a proper programmer, I should have a try-catch around this.
Oh, okay.
To catch any exceptions and say, hey, 400, something wrong happened.
So,
That's an excellent comment.
Okay. Thank you very much. And other question, if I could, about, formulate it a little bit. Что я хотел спросить вообще? Oh my God, I forgot.
Should we go back to you and have this
Okay,
gentleman
thank
first?
you very much.
Welcome.
Кто следующий? Так, вон я вижу одну руку. И еще одну вижу.
Hi, thank you for your speech. I have a questions next step. I should catch all dispatch. Any handlers can send any exceptions, and I should. How I know which exceptions I should catch in this place?
What I do, This is some Symfony. This is Symfony stuff. I'm not sure if I'm being a self-claimed Symfony expert here or not. But what I do is I let all the validation exception bubble up. So I don't catch validation exception because I have another exception listener. You know, something listen to kernel exception, and I check there if it's a validation exception, then through a 400 and has some nice styling. So I don't care about validation exception here. I should care about all the exceptions that are thrown from my handler. Like, here would be a good example, like, username is already taken. I should listen to that exception. And you can have multiple cache statements that make sure that you cache the right thing and give the caller a good response.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
Так, вон я вижу. Вспомнил вопрос. Да.
Sorry, it's maybe a little bit stupid, but I want to ask again about
Sure.
validation.
Да ладно,
About
давай.
validation, you're making validation inside the creating of this create user, yes, using a certain Symfony, you're making some rules, and in this case, you can't create invalid create user object, yes, because it's validated.
Yeah.
But the data inside could be not consistent, yes, for example. Always have to all rule. In this case, if it can't be invalid, should we create middlewares in the handler to validate the create user or not?
Yeah, okay. About creating users, yes, obviously the validation annotation is not always enough. Like I mentioned, we don't know if the username already exists or not.
Yes.
So we should do as much validation here as we possibly can. And then in the handler, that the handler should obviously check if this user is already registered.
In this case, we just check here about some typically about length, structure, or about length and other. And about the consistency of the data, we should check in the middleware in the handler.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, thank you very much.
Excellent.
Следующий кто?
Do any of you have any questions in Ukrainian and want to be translated? That's also fine. I'm sure my friend here can help you with
Hello. Thank you for your speech. Can you please name the most fastest and the most reliable message broker in your opinion?
The most fastest reliable message broker, there is a PHP extension that's called AMQP extension. And extensions are written in C, and C is way faster than PHP. So I will say the AMQ extension. And that's the message broker, and that's the method that's used by default on the messenger component.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
Не, ну серьезно, если кто-то на английском не может, то можно на украинском спросить, мы переведем. То есть не проблема. Также и ответ можем перевести. Хорошо, просто вопросы. У тебя был вопрос.
Спасибо за доклад. Thank you for a great talk. I don't like this type hint, like annotations and checks related on any logical related on annotations. Why do you use this? Why do you think it's this line is better than the same line in the method code?
I use it because I like it. If you don't, sorry, I have no better answer than that. I use it because I like it. If you like to write your, rules, your validator rules in PHP, YAML, and XML, you're free to do that. And the performance is exactly the same. I just like to have them close together.
Okay, it's a Hello World question. We will continue it later. Another question is about the common buses. Do you nest common buses and spread the command to different buses while passing the same? Okay, you put the command in bus number 1, then it comes to some point, and you pass this command to another bus. It executes in the second bus, and the control flow is returned back to the first bus, and so on and so on. Or you prefer to do it just straight and never go to another buses?
That's an excellent question, and the answer is you can do however you like. You can configure it with middlewares. What I really like, that's something that's not supported with Symfony yet. I like to have I have my command bus and a command handler, and all the events that it dispatches, I want to handle them later. So I finishing handle the register user command, and then when everything is done, the user is registered, then I handle the events, like sending emails and stuff. And the reason I want to do this is because if I have a sender email event listener, that may fail. And if you fail to send an email, you should still register a user, right?
No.
Yes, you should. You should.
It's your business requirement.
Sure. In my business requirement, you should. So since command handlers are handled with one doctrine transaction, I want to make sure that they are as small as possible and always succeeds. And then I handle all the extra stuff with sending emails in a different bus, and I do it in a later time in a different doctrine transactions. So using a lot of nested things, like you have a command handler, then dispatch an event, then dispatch another event, you have a lot of buses, that could be a bit of a mess.
Yeah, it's really a mess during debugging.
Yeah,
indeed. It was the point of my question.
Indeed.
Yes.
So try to avoid it.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Еще у кого-то вопрос, может, есть?
Do we have any more questions?
Хорошо. Я думал, можно... нет. Хорошо. Я уже прям думал заворачивать. Окей, еще один вопросик.
Hello.
Hello.
Okay, maybe this is out of topic, but when we talk about messages, what about versioning? If you have your application change your version, and then you have another event or message which is in queue, and how you should guarantee that all messages from previous version are completed and handled?
Oh, that's an excellent question. That's an excellent question. So I can repeat a little bit. So if you put a message on the queue, it gets serialized on the queue, and then you update your application with a new version. You add the new properties to that message class, and then you deserialize it, you may get an error. And honestly, I currently don't handle it at all. I don't really care. I don't really care. I don't change my messages that much. I also written tests because I put some messages, I JSON encode some messages, put them on a queue, and use them in the event store. And I shouldn't really change event store messages. So I have a test that makes sure I don't rename or remove any properties of those events. But other than that, I don't handle it. I know though that Marco, that spoke here earlier, he's an expert on event sourcing, and he probably have a really good answer to that question. But I can't name a good solution I can be proud of. Excellent question, though.
Okay. Thank you.
Окей, хорошо. Я думаю, давайте поблагодарим. Tobias, choose the best question.
Two of the best questions.
Okay, two best questions. Yeah.
I like this last question and the first question with the guy in the shirt.
Okay.
Also, I'm gonna be around for the rest of the day. I'm gonna be somewhere. I'm happy to answer questions even now or tomorrow on Twitter or whatever. So please feel free to approach me.
Если что, то да, тут можно будет продолжить общение.
Excellent. Thank you very much.